Today's topic is web application security. We are going to cover web application security in two parts, and this is the first part. So in this first part, we are going to talk about general security concepts, and then we will talk about web tier application security requirements and schemes. And then we are going to cover two most important authentication schemes for web application: HTTP basic authentication and form-based authentication. Then we will talk about security realm management. So let's talk about general security issues or concepts. So three important security concepts or issues. First, authentication. Authentication is used for identity verification. It makes sure a user is who he or she claims he or she is. Authorization, sometimes called access control, is for making sure resources are accessible only to users who have access privilege to those resources. And of course, user has to be authenticated first. Confidentiality, sometimes called privacy, is for protecting sensitive data from prying eyes while data is transported on the wire. So let's talk about web tier security requirements and schemes. The security requirements at web tier include preventing unauthorized users from accessing access-controlled web resource. By access-controlled web resource, we mean resource that need to be protected. So if an unauthenticated user tried to access these access-controlled web resources, web container will automatically ask the user to authenticate himself or herself first by prompting username and password. Once the user is authenticated, then web container will enforce access control, making sure the authenticated user has also right access control to those resources, access privileges to those resources. Security requirement at web tier also includes preventing attackers or prying eyes from changing or reading sensitive data while the data is on the wire. For example, credit card information or password of a user need to be protected. And these data can be encrypted using SSL. So let's talk about the steps of what happens when authentication is performed. First, user identity information needs to be collected from the user, typically through username and password login from the browser interface. And this is called the logging in for most web applications. And then this identity information, user identity information, needs to be transported either securely or unsecurely. So if you're using HTTP, the password information is going to be in clear text, so that's unsecure. So you want to encrypt the password using SSL in most cases. And then once user identity information is received, the web container needs to perform identity checking against the backend security database. So these security databases are called security realms. Basically, they maintain username and password and roles. Now, how these security realms are organized and managed are product and operating system dependent. And examples of the security realms include LDAP, relational database. It could be even flat file, or it could be operating system specific structure such as Active Directory for Windows environment. Now, once a user has been authenticated, the web container now keeps track of previously authenticated users for subsequent HTTP operations. And it's doing that by using internally maintained session state. So web container knows if the caller of subsequent HTTP request has been authenticated or not. So we learned the cookie scheme, the session tracking scheme in web application this course, and that's how a web container can keep track of a user has been in fact authenticated or not. So web container creates HTTP servlet request object for subsequent HTTP request, and this contains security context information such as principal or role or username. So you can get this information through APIs of HTTP servlet request object. And then the web application developer and deployer specifies access control to the web resources, and web container now enforces this access control that is specified by the developer through access control schemes. Confidentiality, it provides confidentiality of the sensitive data that is being transported over the wire. Again, credit card information or login password belong to this category of sensitive data that need to be protected from prying eyes. So there are 4 web tier authentication schemes supported by servlet architecture. The first one is HTTP basic authentication. Second is form-based authentication. And third is client certificate authentication. And fourth is digest authentication. So we are going to cover just the first 2 in this presentation. And web security part 2, we will cover the remaining client certificate authentication and digest authentication schemes. Now, both HTTP basic authentication and form-based authentication can be used with or without SSL. So let's talk about HTTP basic authentication-based web tier security. The reason we name it as HTTP basic authentication based web tier security is because the security schemes not only includes authentication but also includes access control as well as data confidentiality, and depending on which authentication scheme you're using, the way things work for access control and the data confidentiality might be impacted. So HTTP basic authentication. So in this scheme, web server collects user identity information, username and password, through browser provided dialog box. And as a default, it's not secure because username and passwords are easily decodable over the wire because it's encoded using base 64. So it's not encrypted. So if you want to protect the password, then you want to use SSL for encrypting password. So these are the steps that you want to follow for implementing basic authentication based web tier security. First, you want to set up realms, security realms per your operating environment. So username, password, and roles. So depending on which server you're using, you might actually use server-specific administration tool to set up username and password and roles. So if you're using Tomcat, Tomcat will use Tomcat-specific way of specifying username and passwords and roles, and same thing for Glassfish. And then you tell web container that you are using basic authentication. So you're going to set that in web.xml file. And then you specify which URLs, meaning which web resources, should be access controlled, meaning password protected. And you also specify which URLs should be accessible only through SSL, meaning data integrity and confidentiality are also needed for those resources. So let's talk about each of these steps in a bit more detail. First, set up username, password, and roles. Again, it means setting up the realms. So the schemes and APIs and tools for setting up username and password and roles are, again, web container and operating system environment specific. In general, they include flat file-based database or LDAP server. So those are all possible security realms. And passwords could be either in encrypted or unencrypted form. In development environment, they might be in unencrypted form, but in production server, production environment, they must be in encrypted form. And for Tomcat, Tomcat supports as a default file unencrypted form of security realm. So you can add the user and you can change the user and by just changing Tomcat users.xml file. However, it does support relational database as well as LDAP server for production environment. So this is an example of Tomcat. So Tomcat, you can go to config directory, and then there is Tomcat users.xml file, and you can see this unencrypted form of users, roles, and passwords. So here we define 3 different roles: manager, employee, and admin, and then we define a single user whose username is Sang and password is Sang password, and roles, this user belong to manager and employee. Remember, these roles and users and passwords are Tomcat specifics. Okay. So this is Tomcat users.xml file. So going back to the statement I just made. So you want to write your application to be a server independent manner, meaning you want to specify your security schemes in abstract fashion without being tied up with a particular server. So there has to be some translation between, let's say, the abstract, the username and password to a server specific username and password. And we'll look into that when we are doing some hands-on lab using Glassfish. Now, step 2, you're going to tell web container that you are using basic authentication. So the way that you specify that you are using basic authentication is adding log config element in your web.xml file, and inside auth method, you specify basic. And then you specify the relevant name. But what's important here is auth method element on the log config. And here you specify basic. That means you are telling to the container that you are using basic authentication, meaning you want to use a browser provided login dialog box. Okay, now you specify which URLs should be access controlled. Okay, so here we are basically saying that any URL that ends with /load price list, okay, and the HTTP get is get method. So any HTTP get method trying to access this URL pattern is access controlled. And here we are saying is that only admin role can access this resource. So if any other user is trying to access this resource, then it will be access denied. Now you specify, in step 4, you specify which URLs, meaning which resources should be available only with SSL. So here you specify user data constraint, and you specify the confidential as a value of transport guarantee. That means any data that is being accessed here is going to be secured through SSL. Okay, so form-based authentication. So we just covered basic authentication-based web tier security. Now we are going to look into form-based authentication-based web tier security, meaning how we can use form-based authentication. So form-based authentication, here you are saying that you are providing custom login page. So instead of using browser-provided login dialog box, you are going to provide your own custom login page. Just like a basic authentication, as a default, it's not secure, meaning again it's using base 64 as an encoding scheme, and it's easily decodable, so it's not secure, meaning it's not encrypted. So if you want to secure a password, then you need to use SSL. So this is how form-based authentication the scheme works. So let's say number one, suppose user is trying to access control resource or protected resource. And number two, the container will check whether the client is authenticated. So if the client is not authenticated, then the user will be redirected to login.jsp page. That is step number 3. And the user will enter username and password, and then it will pass that information to a built-in login scheme, the scheme or login logic called the JSecurity check. So JSecurity check will check whether that user is in fact a valid user or not. It verifies the identification. And then if that is successful, that's step number 6, and it will redirect to the resource. And then authorization, access control will be performed, and if the user has right access control, access privilege, and the page will be displayed. Otherwise, error page will be displayed. So in this case, whether a login failed because authentication failed or access control failed, we are displaying a page. So these are a little bit of repeat of what I just said in the previous slide. The first, you have to set up username and password and roles. That's the same thing for basic authentication. So that's actually one-time deal, okay, for your environment, operating environment. And number 2, you tell web container that you are using form-based authentication instead of basic authentication or client certificate-based authentication, or as opposed to digest-based authentication. And here are 2 extra steps that you need to do compared to basic authentication scheme is you have to provide your login page, and you have to provide your own login failure error page. And then number 5 and 6 are the same with basic authentication, specifying which resources should be access controlled and which resources should be available only through SSL. So this is the same. Step number 1 is the same thing. I mean, this is again one-time deal. And step number 2, the difference here is that you are going to specify form instead of basic, okay? Which means here you are saying you are using form-based authentication. Step number 3 is custom login page you have to provide. So it could be either HTML or JSP page. And here, for action attribute value, you can specify J_security_check. So this is a built-in the logic that is provided by the container. So you don't have to actually provide this logic; it is provided. Okay. And for username and password, you have to use J_username and J_password. So this is how JSecurity check logic knows what is the value of the username and what is the value of the password that were collected from the browser interface. And then you have to provide login failure page. It could be any page. Meaning you don't have to specify there is any there is not any required content in this page. It could be just any HTML page or JSP page. Okay, and then step 5, we are going to specify which resources should be access controlled. Again, this is the same as in basic authentication, so nothing to add. And same thing with step 6. Okay, so again, same as basic authentication, you specify which resources need to be accessed only through SSL. Okay, so this
slide shows the difference between basic versus form-based authentication. So one difference between basic and form-based authentication is that in basic authentication scheme, it is a browser-provided dialog box that prompted the user to enter username and password, while in form-based authentication scheme, you provide your custom login page for prompting username and password. Because you're using browser-provided dialog, only username and password can be collected in basic authentication. While form-based authentication, because you can create you can create your own login page, you can collect any information of your choice. Because different browser might actually present different look and feel of the dialog box, it might result in different look and feel. While form-based, you could actually control the look and feel regardless of the browser that is being used. In basic authentication, the username and password is actually transported through the header, HTTP authentication header, while in form-based authentication, the data is going to be transported inside the form data page, form data, the area. And so in basic authentication, there is no good way to enter new username, while in form-based authentication, you can actually provide a way for entering a new username via login page. Okay, so let's talk about the realm, security realm management. So we touched upon this one a little bit. So security realm management basically is a management of user identity information on the particular operating environment, depending on the server and operating system. So it manages username and password and groups and things like that. And those information could be maintained either encrypted form or unencrypted form, but mostly in encrypted form in production environment. Again, it's a container and operational environment dependent. So you have a different way of actually managing this security realm information for Tomcat and Glassfish app server. And most of these servers actually support relational database and LDAP based the realms. Security roles. So web application developer use abstract security roles for access control. So you can use both declaratively or programmatically, but these are abstract roles that has nothing to do with the username and password or groups of a particular operating environment or server. So at application deployment time, these abstract security roles that you specify in your application, either declaratively or programmatically, have to be mapped to real username and password and groups of that particular operating environment. So in the case of Glassfish, for web application, you are going to actually use what is called the Glassfish web.xml file to map that abstract roles with the actual principles and groups of a particular operating environment. In production environment, external security realms such as LDAP can be used both by web application and OS. So in the case of Tomcat, again, Tomcat users.xml file contains this, in this case, as a default for development environment, unencrypted principles, roles, and things like that. And you can change this file either manually using your favorite editor, or you can actually change it through admin tool, admin console of Tomcat. This is a way that you can change in admin tool. So we can actually take a look at the Glassfish way of actually changing things and how we can map the abstract role that you declare in your web.xml file to the actual principles and groups of Glassfish file security realm. Okay, how to secure passwords on the wire for basic and phone-based authentication. So basically, you can specify either confidential or integral on a security constraint, and then information will be transported through SSL. So this is something that we have seen. Okay. All right, so that's the end of the presentation. So let's take a look at the hands-on lab. So in the hands-on lab, we are going to run, the first exercise is running basic authentication over Glassfish, and the second exercise is running phone-based authentication over Glassfish. Okay. So here, first thing we want to do is we want to set up the security realm. So let's actually go to admin console. So you're going to start your server, Glassfish server first, and then you're going to start admin console. And then you're going to specify security, and you can see default realm for Glassfish is set to file realm. Okay, in fact, there's LDAP and things like that. So let me actually try. Let's actually try that. So we'll go to the servers. So it's already started. Let's check the admin console. And I have already added a few users. It's taking its time, so let's actually move on with the so this is the way that you can add users. Okay, so I have added let's say 3 users. Okay, so this is the way, the username and the groups that user belongs to and the password. Okay, so I have added build password and Java J2E password. So these are 3 users and their groups, the groups they belong to. Okay, so let's see whether it is done. Okay, so here we go. So let's just verify that is the case. We go to server configuration and select security. Again, if you double click security, you can see the file is a default realm, but you can pick and choose other the realms as well. Okay, okay, so we are gonna go to file realm, click file realm, and so we are going to click manage users, and I have already added 3 users, J2EE, and J2E belongs to group called the my group 2, Bill belongs to my group 1 and Steph, and Sang belongs to my group 1 and my group 2. Now these are username and password and groups relevant only to Glassfish. Okay, all right, so let's go back to the the lab documentation. Now I'm going to run basic auth Glassfish. Okay, so we are going to actually see it's running Glassfish. Okay, 3.1, and now if I run it, it's going to ask me to enter username and password. Okay, so I'm going to try XYZ and XYZ, which is not a valid username, and then we are going to see this one again, because this application is designed so that when the authentication failed, it will just redisplay. The browser will actually redisplay the login screen. Now, if I enter Sang and Sang, then I will actually get 404, because the way this application is designed. Let's actually take a look at the code first, and then we're going to run the application. So when we actually see web.xml file, it is set as the basic authentication, and then we are defining security role called the step member. This is the abstract role. This role has nothing to do with the Glassfish or Tomcat, the groups. Okay. All right. So now any URL for this application can be accessed only through step member abstract role. Okay. Now we have to map this abstract role step member to the actual, let's say, the Glassfish specific principal name and group. So this is the Glassfish web.xml file. So in Glassfish web.xml file, we have the security roles mapping here. What it means is that for any abstract role for step member, this principal, either this principal called J2E belongs to this member, or any member in this staff will actually belong to this role. So here, we have in fact the two principals that qualify. So J2EE and also any member in the staff. So in the staff is let's see who is actually belonging to staff. Yeah, so Bill. So either J2E or Bill should be able to access this page. Okay. All right. So Sang, if you actually try to use Sang and Shin, it will actually access the denied. Okay. So let's try this thing. So by the way, because the browser actually caches, the information, you have to actually close all the browser instances to actually run the application again. All right. So let's run that application. So here I'm gonna go to and run that application. Okay, so here if I try, let's say XXX, which is invalid, then it will just keep asking, provide the valid information. Okay, so if I say Sang and Shin, which is not the belonging to staff, the group, it will actually have the access denied. Okay. Now let's actually try. So I have to actually close all these browsers, and then we are going to try again. So run this application. Now let's try the Bill, because Bill belongs to staff group in Glassfish. The Bill should be able to access that page. So here, Bill and Bill password. Okay. Now you can see Bill can access the page. Okay. All right. Now the next exercise is so that's actually something we have seen. Okay. Yeah. Go all the way here. Now what I want to do is I want to change the Glassfish web.xml file so that not only is anybody that belongs to staff group, but also anybody that belongs to my group 1. Okay, also can access the page. So Sang is actually in fact the belong to my group 1. So if I add this one, then Sang should be able to access the page as well. Okay, so let's try that. So I'm gonna add that to here, web page web.inf. This is a Glassfish web.xml file. So here I'm gonna just use XML format here. So I'm gonna add this line. Okay, and save the change. And now we are going to run the application. Now, last time when we tried to use Sang as a user, okay, I have to actually close all that. Last time Sang is trying to access the page, he actually received the access denied, right? Okay, this time because we added a new group, my group 1, now Sang should be able to access that page as well. Okay, like this. All right. So I'm going to just delete this guy so that it actually goes back to original state. Okay, now the next exercise is form-based authentication. So form-based authentication, you have to provide your own form. Okay, so here you can see I'm using form-based authentication. Okay. And so let's see, the security relevant information is pretty much the same. Okay, so now when you run the application, you're going to see custom login page. Okay, and as far as the security is concerned, it works exactly the same. Okay, so I'm gonna run this form auth Glassfish and run. So now you can see, it's actually using custom login page. Okay, so again, if I try to like a CCC or something that is invalid, now we are going to actually see simple error message, which is actually from the browser. Okay, and you can actually also provide the your own error page. That is actually basically this application. Okay, so here if I oh, it looks like it's the same error page. Oh, the access denied is actually a different page. Okay, so let's say the Sang Shin, and then yeah, so it's actually providing its own custom access denied page. Okay. All right, so that's pretty much the exercises. Okay. All right, thank you.